Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, has pledged that all dangerous cladding in high-rise buildings across the UK will be removed by the end of 2029. Funding for her plans will be covered by the government and will come with tougher penalties for landlords who refuse to act. But the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign group has called the plans extremely disappointing. The Building Safety Minister Alex Norris gave his response to Asma Mir on Breakfast this morning.
Yeah, I don't accept that characterisation. I've spoken to them about this, as you'd expect. I'm seeing them again later this week. I appreciate, and their campaigning efforts are considerable, and I appreciate their strength of feeling on this. As I say, the choice is not between a lever that we can pull in government today that resolves it tomorrow, because if so, we would pull that lever. The choice is between a trajectory that takes us into the 2040s, or what we're putting as the first government to draw a line in the sand and say 2029. And just to illustrate why it is so challenging, at the moment in this country, one of the first questions I asked upon being minister, how many buildings are we talking about here? The reality is we don't know.
Well, for tonight's debate, I've been talking to Martina Lees, senior property writer at The Times, and Jennifer Frame, an End Our Cladding Scandal campaigner whose own home was destroyed by a fire 2 years after Grenfell. Martina began by explaining more about the government's plans.
Well, today the government announced what they called a radical plan to speed up the pace at which buildings that are unsafe are being fixed. But in my books, it's not radical at all. Their big news line is that there are new deadlines, target deadlines, which are called stretch targets, to fix all tall buildings over 18 meters that are funded by taxpayers within 5 years, and to have a plan or a completion date to fix buildings over 11 meters, so mid-rise buildings, also by that time. And then they talk a lot about investing more in enforcement to get building landlords to take action to fix their buildings. But there is very little there that actually addresses the root causes of why I think about 600,000 people are still living in dangerous homes.
Yeah, it's quite something that there are still 600,000 living in those circumstances well over 7 years since the Grenfell Tower. Jennifer, what do you make of what the government has announced?
Well, it's quite disappointing, really. I mean, is a deadline better than no deadline? Possibly, but it's so far away, it's almost ineffective. It's really hard to imagine how somebody in the government thought this would be good news for people today. High-rise buildings, as Martina said, now have a 5-year completion date. Just imagine that's 12 years after Grenfell already. But actually, the majority of buildings are mid-rise. So the majority of people are just being told that in 5 years' time, we might be able to give you a timeline. So it could still be another 10 years, 15 years. I don't know how anyone thought that was going to give comfort to people today. And what it's not doing, well, what it is doing is really taking the existing processes and saying, we're going to do a little bit to speed them up. We're going to put a bit more pressure on people. We're going to get the local regulators enforcing things more. But actually, that can sometimes have really detrimental impacts on the people living in those buildings. There are a lot of people that we're worried are going to be moved out of their homes before Christmas because they can't afford the waking watch patrols. They can't afford insurance. They're going to go bankrupt. And so if we're going to see those enforcement measures, we also need to see those measures that really put people at the heart of this and say, how is this actually going to impact people in their homes? And at the moment, it doesn't feel like the people that are affected by this are at the heart of this policy.
We heard, Martina, before the election, commitments from Labour that they were actually going to have some kind of task force and we're going to move much more rapidly on this, didn't we?
Yes, Labour previously, about 3 years ago, came up with the idea of a building works agency, which is supposed to be one body that both assesses the buildings, decide what works gets done, and then funds it and then signs it off at the end. And that would be a brilliant way to really tackle this, because one of the problems that has really held things up is we now have a situation where lots of different companies are on the hook to pay for buildings, and they all fight against each other to limit their liabilities. So in many cases, big developers are legally bound to fix their buildings, but they are only bound to fix what a surveyor that they appoint tells them to fix. and then they have these arguments with the government and with the building landlord about how much work should be done. And this has caused people so much anxiety. I know of buildings where it's held up things for 2-3 years already. And these are people who cannot move jobs, who are stuck with small children in small flats, who have severe mental health issues. I have written about one woman who have died from an overdose of anxiety medication because of the uncertainty and the delays. So it just, so if there is one agency that takes it on and decides and funds and then checks that it's all done correctly, that would go a long way. But that is not in this plan. What is in there is stricter penalties for building landlords. So there's talk of criminal charges for the first time for building landlords who do not take action to fix their buildings. But as Jennifer touched on, what has happened to date, where we've seen enforcement on buildings, it's what happens in practice is the fire brigade will come in, inspect the building, and then they'll say, this building is very unsafe. And then they'll issue what's called a prohibition notice, which means that the building is so unsafe that the people there have to immediately bring in a 24/7 waking watch fire patrol, which costs them a lot of money. And in some cases, it's so serious that the building gets shut down and they literally have to move out of their own homes. People who have bought a flat are not allowed to live in them. I have interviewed people, one lady near Manchester who bought a flat over 3 years ago. She has not been able to live in her own flat for more than 3 years because the building was shut down and the landlord has not done anything to fix it. So these enforcement notices punishes the people who live in the buildings rather than the building landlords who own it. So I am worried that, having bigger penalties for landlords is just going to create more of these situations where the leaseholders get thrown out of their own homes because the building is not being fixed.
It sounds a really distressing situation for many, many people. I mean, the Housing Minister, Alex Norris, today is saying that developers could face fines or even criminal sanctions if the deadlines aren't met. And Jennifer, I seem to remember previous housing secretaries saying that the developers have got to pay and have got to sort this out.
Absolutely. And there has been some action in that direction. Even, for example, the last Housing Secretary, they took some legal cases against a few freeholders and developers. And the average legal costs were £170,000. I mean, in my own case, we've been taking legal action against our developer for over 5 years, and it's a multi-million-pound bill. This isn't the way to tackle a systemic national scandal. As Martina said earlier, what we need is the government to come in and actually take a firm grip and take control and actually drive that through their own agency or something like that, like the Works Agency that they spoke about in 2021.
You mentioned your own circumstances. Just explain to people listening then. I mean, where are you living? What's your experience of this?
So my building was Richmond House in Worcester Park, southwest London, and it was destroyed completely by a fire just over 2 years after Grenfell. It was a low-rise building. It wasn't cladding issues, it was other non-cladding defects. The government is still not addressing the fact that actually non-cladding defects are just as serious as cladding defects. And can you just imagine that if the government had taken a grip of this issue in the first place, that my neighbours and I might still have our homes effectively. So we've spent 5 years battling our developer, despite the fact that it was a really, clear, egregious issue. It was all over the news. It was a massive inferno. But even in cases like that, it's really difficult to take action. And we've been left as individuals to fend for ourselves effectively. And so I'm really concerned, particularly today, that there isn't anything still for low-rise buildings. Low-rise buildings are being told that normally, typically they're not as high risk as taller buildings, but in some cases they are. And in those cases, we need there to be action so that people aren't left like us fighting for justice for 5 years and spending, huge amounts of money to go through the legal process.
Just before I go back to Martina, where have you been living then, Jennifer?
So most of us have been living in temporary accommodation. Our building has only just been rebuilt. We had the choice to go back to it or not, and I went and visited my home but decided not to go back. So actually only 3 households have gone back. because obviously it's a like-for-like building, and just imagine laying down your head to go to sleep in exactly the same building that you've seen completely destroyed by a fire. So actually for most of us, we're now struggling to work out where we're going to live in the future, because, trying to find somewhere that you can afford when we were shared ownership leaseholders before. So it's completely changed the path of all of our lives in these 5 years.
It sounds like an absolutely horrendous situation to go through. And Martina, Jennifer's not alone, is she? I know of people who have been in buildings which have been declared unsafe, even though it's not the cladding, it's other unsafe materials in the blocks. And that then affects more and more people who can't move or are in unsafe buildings.
Yes, I mean the fallout from Grenfell and the nationwide safety scandal it exposed affected more than 3 million people who live in flats that they couldn't sell, couldn't get a mortgage on, or that are unsafe. And the National Audit Office recently did a report, and they said only between 12 and 16% of the unsafe homes have been fixed since Grenfell. So, and about almost 2/3 of the homes that are not safe still haven't been identified. So we're a very long way from everything being fixed. I mean, the government told me in a briefing over the weekend that we're looking at the 2040s before all the buildings are fixed at the current rate. So it is just what you need here to really end the scandal is a much bigger step back and look at it all. And you can't just do one little penalty for a building landlord and set a deadline and think that's going to change things. So I mean, they have to start with, first of all, having protection and funding for all leaseholders, whatever is wrong with your building, not just cladding, but other stuff too, and whatever the height of your building, like Jennifer's building, that's under 11 meters, so that there is a way to get it fixed. And secondly, they have to bring in an agency who will do all of this, which we've talked about. And then thirdly, to fund all of this, I mean, the government has budgeted over £9 billion in taxpayers' money, and then they're getting a lot more money from developers separately as well. But they've only spent about a quarter of the money that they've budgeted for overall. So there is a lot of money available, but they haven't spent it.
Just before we finish, Jennifer, briefly, are you disappointed at the Labour government's approach to this?
Yes, I mean, I think people across the country are disappointed. I'd go as far as to say quite angry today, actually, at how it falls far short of what we were promised when Labour were in opposition. So, a deadline is better than no deadline, but it's only addressing half of the problem. It's only looking at making buildings half safe. So there's no point speeding up when you're not actually fixing the real problem and you're not working a way to resolve the disputes that are holding things up. So we'd like to see this as the start of a process, and we think they need to do much, much more in the next few months to really get a grip of this.
Well, that was Jennifer Frame from the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, and Martina Lees, senior property writer at The Times,